Thanks everybody for coming to this ASPP event, the first one of 2015. And probably a lot of you are familiar with ASPP. If you're not, just a real quick rundown, because anybody who's in the photo and picture community should be familiar with ASPP, American Society of Picture Professionals. It goes back a good 30 years or so. I've been a member all of my career, which is about that. And it's really the only organization that is for everybody who works in the photography or image industry. Not just for photographers, not just for art directors, but for editors, for photo researchers, designers, publishers, everybody across the gamut. It's an organization that brings all those people together in meetings like this, and also through their website. Find a photographer, find a professional. It's good for career announcements. They have a job bank. A lot of times publishers and others who need to hire picture professionals contact ASPP, and if you're a member, you get the emails about that. There's also a number of discounts that you get as ASPP members, such as from Apple and Adobe and a lot of other people that you can see on the website. Again, ASPP.com. And, oh, I should have introduced myself to start with. I'm Tom Ware. I'm the Seattle chapter president. I'm co-president along with Chris Denena of the West chapter in general. He's down in LA and doing presentations and panels down there. We have chapters, of course, all over the country. So for this one, this really kind of exemplifies what ASPP is about, because it crosses the disciplines of photography and other image collections and archives. A lot of ASPP members are archivists, people who work in, well, what was the Batman, what was the Holton, etc. So talking specifically this evening, we're really lucky to have a great panel. And first of all, Ellen Vaughn. And Ellen's going to introduce herself and the other two panelists, but I just want to acknowledge Zan Gerson and Jennifer Stutz. And I also want to, while I'm acknowledging and thanking folks, I want to very much thank Danita Delamont of the Danita Delamont Agency for sponsoring the evening. She has a great agency located right across the lake in Bellevue, specializing in travel, nature, wildlife. And I've actually worked at that agency off and on, and she's really one of the best. So without further ado, we'll pass it on to Ellen.
Okay, well, I'm going to stand up just to see where I can sit down. I want to welcome you, and I want to thank Danita. All the images that I've used in my presentation came from her collection.
Okay, thanks.
I'm doing this in an analog electrical fashion, so excuse me for being a little bit disoriented, disorganized. I've worked in the business for many years. I worked at Corbis. Thank you, Corbis, for that, and thank you for this evening. That was a long time ago. Some of the people I worked with are here in the room. So tonight, we're going to talk to you about something nobody ever wants to think about. And I'm going to tell you a story about my father. My father had a massive heart attack when he was about my age, and it was touch and go, touch and go. He finally recovered, and he was home, and I was talking to him about how stressful it was for myself and my mother. And he said, you know, I never thought this would happen to me. And I said, what? You're overweight. Your doctor told you for years you can have a heart attack. He said, no, not a heart attack, that I would die. I said, you never thought you would die? No, and I don't think any of us really think we're going to die. But we do need to plan for it, especially when you have an asset that is so intangible as a copyright. It's not a car, a house, maybe it's a painting, and it's definitely, they're definitely assets. The intangible ones of the copyrights you can't even really hold. You can hold the registration. And so tonight we're going to have myself speaking about I value copyrights and licensing, and Zan is an estate attorney, and Jennifer is involved in fine art photography, and I'll tell you more about them. Now I'm going to sit down so I can read my presentation. The best practices for planning for the, maybe, can everyone hear me without this microphone?
Use the mic because of the recording.
Oh, okay.
Don't you think, Tom?
Yeah.
All right. It just, okay. The best practices for planning for the future of an archive are equally good business practices for the day-to-day. And what I'm trying to say is, you may be 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. There's never a good time to think about the future, but it's time right now, no matter how old you are, because these are business practices that you should be practicing throughout a career. Okay, so Alexandra is known as Zan. She's an estate planning attorney with Helsel and Fetterman in Seattle. She assists clients with all aspects of estate planning, including wealth transfer, business succession, tax, and philanthropy. Zan will speak about the legal vehicles available to photographers and fine art collectors to assist with the management and transition of their estate during incapacity or following death, and to preserve the value of their legacy. Photographers are in a dangerous profession. And so photographers don't think about what would happen if suddenly something happened. Who wants to think about it? But if you do the right planning, then at least that worry about who's going to keep getting, who's in charge of the copyrights, who's taking care of my business while I'm incapacitated, is taken care of. Jennifer is an accredited fine art appraiser certified in photography with the Appraisers Association of America. Based in Portland, Jennifer has been professionally involved in the arts for 20 years, appraising fine art and photography for 13. She will speak to best practices for photographers and collectors of fine art photography as it pertains to estate and legacy issues. Whoops, I forgot that slide up. Oops. I wanted to learn how to play the piano when I was about 9. And I had a recital, and it consisted mainly of me going, oops. So that's the slide you're supposed to have. And you should have had a resource page that has the email and contact information for those two ladies. Okay, what I'm going to talk about tonight is the valuation of an archive. And the reason that this event and several that Jennifer has organized came about was because Jennifer and I were involved in the valuation of estate of a very, very important 20th century photographer who had his foot in both worlds. His photographs, his signed prints were very valuable, and his copyrights, based on my valuation, some of them I felt would last and have value and revenue through this full 70 years of the copyright. And we realized, working in that estate, that people just leave horrible nightmares for their heirs. And it remains and will remain for some years, I think, in probate as it tries to get itself figured out. I've been involved in licensing photography and illustration for over 35 years. I was a senior editor at Corvus, I think the first commercial editor for commercial work. Currently, I offer expert witness and appraisal services to law firms, photographers, and estates. Okay, where's that button again?
Just do the arrow.
Yeah, which arrow? Okay, when I value an estate or when I'm involved in appraisals or dealing with unauthorized use, there are usually two objectives that are typical of valuation objectives, and the ones we'll discuss tonight include present value of future licensing revenue. It's kind of a complicated concept, but I think I can explain it pretty simply. In keeping with our overall topic, I will not address issues involved in valuation for unauthorized use. Oops, well, that's out of order. Future cash flows are estimated and discounted by using the cost of capital to give their present values. So when I value the copyrights, I'm looking at future revenue. I can't just look at the money, the revenue from today, say, or the last 3 years. I have to say, okay, how long is this copyright going to actually, and whether or not it is then registered, it is a copyrighted item or collection, how long will it have value? If it's pictures of pretty ordinary things that are very common, you know, it's hard to say, but I certainly wouldn't put a value out 70 years. But you have to figure out a way to capture time and money so that an estate like the one we were just speaking about, in which I felt certain iconic pictures would have value for 70 years, I have to come up with a formula that explains or that justifies why this collection is going to be worth X amount of money for 70 years. And then I have to take the value of that cash and you use the cost of capital to project out for 70 years and add it up, and you come up with the amount that the estate would value those copyrights. And I'm not making this very understandable, but basically it's you're putting time against money, and you have to discount the money, and the discount that you use is the cost of borrowing money. So you could say simply, if this money existed today, you had to borrow the money, how much would you pay to borrow it? And beyond that, I don't think I can even make it, if I try to talk any more about it, I will make it even more unclear. And you don't need to know about it, you just need to know that it needs to be done by somebody who can appraise the copyright or the licensing revenue. The point is to determine how much the collection or a single image will be worth over time in the future, and that's usually not used when you're dealing with unauthorized use. In that case, you're figuring out what should the license have been in the past when the image was misappropriated. Now, I put this up here because I think a lot of people think, and I've had this experience, oh, you know, my estate, I have drawers full of photographs that have made money for years, and they're certainly really valuable. Well, they're not. I'm sorry. The reason is they're not because they're not digitized. There's no metadata attached to them. They're not going to be useful to anyone unless you make sure that that metadata and scanning has been done. Nobody's going to take them for distribution if you don't already have a distributor. And this estate we worked on did not. Why not, I don't know, because they passed on hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. But now they're in the process, and I'm helping them find a proper distributor for these images. And unfortunately, many of them are not digitized at this point, and there's no metadata, which greatly decreases their value. So really iconic photos are the ones that sell again and again, or the ones that are incredibly special. You really have to treat them like your legacy. I mean, they're gold, but they're not any good if you don't have them in a proper format. So the valuation methods, that maybe Jennifer will talk about this as well, but whether it's property or anything else, there's 3 accepted ways to value an asset. Replacement value, well, okay, here's a photographer's work for 35 years. What is the replacement value if those photos were recreated? It's impossible to figure out, and it would be in millions of dollars anyway. Travel in 1978 or something. Comparable values, well, you can use Getty's online pricing for, you know, single use maybe to figure it out. But for the most part, photos are unique. A photographer's work is unique, and if it's not unique, it's probably not going to be very valuable anyway. So you can't really use a comparable like you would in real estate. You know, here's this house, it's comparable, same number of bedrooms, same school district, whatever. It's a comparable, and that's the comparable. It doesn't work. So what I work with are revenue streams. And in this particular estate, there were invoices on napkins. There were invoices on, I don't know, where were they? They were everywhere. They were on different stationery. There was no sequence of numbers. There was no way to figure out. And there were no P&L statements as well. So it was very difficult to find out what did these images actually earn. I knew they earned a lot of money, but it was very hard. It was very difficult for us to figure out what they were. Now, if there had been proper records, it would have been a snap. It would have cost the estate a lot less money. So word of warning. All right, I already did this one. Okay. So why do people value copyrights? when Jennifer was called in to do this estate appraisal, they didn't even know they needed to value, they didn't even want to value the copyright. And she said, well, that's an asset. That's a very important asset of this photographer's estate. You can't do the IRS taxes without taking into account all the assets. So this evening is a result of us figuring out that people didn't even realize that they needed to value those assets. I've done appraisals for a fire and a flood and a commercial collection, donation of the photographer's collection here in Seattle to UW. It was historical. He was not a professional, but because he created the work, and many photographers are not really aware of this, the work you create yourself, if you donate it for a big tax benefit, you're not going to get a tax benefit because the IRS has ruled, I think in 1979, in the Pension Act of 1979, don't quote me, I'm probably wrong on the date, it was decided that artists were donating their work to museums and taking huge tax deductions just because they said, this is what my art is worth. You know, I sell them at the farmer's market every week and so on. So the only thing you can deduct is the cost of materials. And if you're a commercial photographer, you've already deducted all of those costs as cost of doing business on your income tax. So that's just a fair warning about that. And I think Zan will perhaps speak about ways around that. Yes, maybe. We hope. We can ask her. I've also done an appraisal of the value of copyrights of a publisher who had wholly owned pictures of different foods. So they wanted an appraisal for a bank loan. Sale of an archive, I appraised 250,000 pictures belonging to a very famous French photographer. And people say, well, how can you do that? Well, you do a sampling. And of course, the unauthorized use is what comes up. The steps in evaluation. The records that I require and generally can't find start with the initial review. And first of all, I say, what's the inventory? What are the records you have? What photos do you have? And what form are they in? And that's when it starts to get really discouraging. Well, here they are. There are 27 file cabinets. Help yourself. No, thank you. What I really like is, well, I'll tell you what I really like at the end, because I'll give you the best practices way to do it, which I guarantee you no one will do. Oh, did I not? What? My prompter is telling me to do something. I don't know what it means.
Do you have next slide?
Next slide. Oh. I wish I had my own computer. Okay. Now I'm completely, all right. I hope you're not filming this, actually. Okay, the key records. Okay, to summarize, the following records should be kept in an easily accessible and understandable fashion. Copyright applications, certifications, and DVDs of the registered work. Distribution contracts, looking for termination dates, royalty, percentages. I want to know, okay, this contract is a terrible one. When does it expire? Oh, and that contract you had with Vanity Fair, did they own those pictures or did you own them? I want to see that assignment contract. I want to know if there's an embargo on those images, and if so, for how long, because that speaks to value. If you can't relicense them, they really have no value to the estate. And of course, I want to know I would really love to see the licensing records of all images that are really sold regularly, licensed regularly, especially iconic, expensive ones. And a profit and loss if all else fails. Depending on what records are available, an appraisal can be undertaken, but without income records, my aspect of licensing valuation is really impossible. Okay, now.
Could you go back to that other?
Sure. I just wanted to scare everybody with this, if I haven't scared you already. Yes?
I just wanted to finish writing.
Oh. Okay. Yeah, you can always just stop me. Since I keep stopping anyway.
I'll ask you a question.
Sure.
Copyright registrations, do you find that the images are more valuable if they've been registered with the U.S. Copyright Office?
Depends.
I'm just
You know.
wondering when you're valuing a collection, if they have a number of images that are actually registered versus those that aren't, do you value that more?
Depends on the image.
Okay.
I mean, if it's a picture of Yosemite and it's by somebody who's shot that a zillion times, it doesn't matter. But if it's a picture of an iconic picture, well, that's a bad example because is Ansel Adams out of, is he out of copyright yet? No. So it would matter a great deal in that case. So it really matters how important the photo is. Especially these days, because there's so many ways that the photographs find themselves flying around where they shouldn't be, and there's, as I'm discovering, very little you can do about it some of the time. But if you have a copyright, you definitely have a better way of getting some money.
Registration.
Yeah, a registration. Okay, now we're back to the scary guy. This is all really scary and confusing, and most photographers I have called in preparation for doing this that, well, I know I'm supposed to do this, but I really don't. I keep records of my income. You know, I've got backups, I've got hard drives everywhere, copyrights. I don't really worry about it too much. Well, in talking to John Harrington, who you may have seen his books or heard him speak, he's the gold standard in the complete totality of registering. He's got it down to a science. And talking to him, I realized if you use a regular way of filing copyrights, the same way as you know, maybe you don't like brushing your teeth, but you need to do it. If you register the copyrights like once a month, that forces a kind of organization on your estate, on your collection, on your work, because you can have all the organization fall down from the copyright. So it's not as scary as it may seem. The key to the maze is really in the registration of copyright. And nobody probably wants to hear that because it's kind of scary. But if you look at the way John does it, his book is called The Best New Practices for Photographers. He told me it takes him less than an hour a month to register up to 6,000 images. I think there's a limit of 6,000 unpublished images. But I refer you to the video that is on my resource list, and I urge you to listen to it. He really gets into how he does it. And it's really compulsive almost, but it really works. Frankly, I don't expect many to follow his best practices, but at the very least, keep basic business records I have mentioned. And always ask yourself, could someone completely unfamiliar with my business walk in here and take it over and ensure that the revenue is going to continue? Or is it just going to be a nightmare that you're going to dump on some unsuspecting spouse, nephew, bank, or somebody else? And you should also consider who should that person be? Who do you want your copyrights to rest with? Okay, so here's a brief summary, a deep dive into John's process. Bulk register all new images once a month or at a regular specific time. Obviously, if you only take a few images in a month, you're probably going to put that off till the next month. Make 2 DVDs of the images. One goes to the Copyright Office with the application, and one goes into your initial file. He has 12 file folders for a year. The DVD goes in there, the application goes in there. He's got a system that he uses, which I won't try to explain, but is on the video, that assigns numbers to the way the Copyright Office likes them. It's automated. Takes him an hour to do 6,000 images. So you put one in a file folder, label it with the date, the application number, the job number, any other pertinent data, subject matter. He's got little boxes, so when the registration certificate comes back, he checks it off so he knows. Other certificate copy and number when it is received, tie it all together to revenue by listing image numbers on all invoices, which I'm sure you all do that. Or do nothing, cross your fingers, and you've got the Las Vegas method. I've given you some resources, and let's see, I think are there any quick questions, because we really want to turn it over to...
I want to say something else. If you register your images and then you find some kind of infringement going on with them and you win the case, you will be awarded more if the images are registered. So it's really...
Well, that's right. I decided not to talk about
I just thought
that.
I'd throw it out.
But it's true.
You're encouraging them to because they should.
But something happened today you might be interested in before I turn it over to Zan. You've all heard about the Haitian photographer whose work was appropriated, and he was offered a settlement of $2 million, which he turned down. And as it turned out today, he was awarded $600,000, I think, or $62,000. Did someone else read that? I just read it on the boat, so I didn't register. I think it was $600,000 because he did something wrong. Please look that up. Do you know about it?
No, I had a separate question.
Oh, okay. Yes.
And that is, and you may have addressed it before I walked in, I apologize for being late. Registration is separate for published and unpublished.
Absolutely. I decided not to talk about the process tonight because there are so many resources and so many places that you can find that out. I would just start, if you want to know the specifics, to go to the Copyright Office website that I listed on the resources. Okay, I'm going to give up now and turn this over to Zan.
Thanks. I'm going to stand. Okay, so now we're going to move into sort of the legal side of all of this, which is how do you preserve your legacy? How do you set up an estate plan? What do you need to do? And I'm going to tell you some scary stories while we're at it. We're going to kick it off with one of my favorite quotes, which is, "What you leave at your death, let it be without controversy, else the lawyers will be your heirs." So something to remember. Oh. I'll do this all once. Okay, so the first set of documents we're going to talk about tonight are the foundational estate planning documents. So this is sort of the basic package that you would get. You come into my office, you say, "Zan, I don't have anything set up," and I'm going to say, "All right, here's what we're going to start with." So these documents are documents that operate during your life while you are alive but incapacitated. So you, for some reason or another, cannot handle your finances or healthcare decisions on your own behalf. Maybe you are just simply in the hospital because you fell out of a cherry picker. Maybe you are in a coma because you fell out of a cherry picker. Either way, these are the documents that you would want to have set up. So the first document is a financial power of attorney. So this is the document that appoints someone to manage your finances on your behalf when you are alive, again, but incapacitated. There is no statute in Washington that says who could do this on your behalf in the event that you don't have a financial power of attorney. So if somebody were to come to me and say, "My brother is in the hospital, he has no family, he's in a coma, I need to step in, I need to pay his mortgage, I need to access his house," that type of thing. The only option is to go to court and get a guardianship. And that goes from being a document that doesn't cost very much to set up to being possibly a couple $1,000 process. You hope that you don't have people fighting over who should be guardian of his estate. But it's a pretty expensive process, and it also takes at least 2 months to actually get a guardian put in place. So it's not a quick process. So again, if you have a financial power of attorney, someone can say, "This person's incapacitated, they have appointed me, and now I get to step into their shoes and manage their finances." The healthcare power of attorney, same type of document. You are appointing someone to make healthcare decisions on your behalf in the event that you cannot. There is a statute in Washington which allows, it has a set list of people who could step in and do this if you don't have one of these. It goes spouse, children, parents, siblings. And one thing's important to note on that schedule of people is that they have to make a decision as a class. So all of your children would need to agree of what healthcare decision to make for you, or all of your siblings. Which isn't necessarily something people want. So something to keep in mind there. The healthcare directive, I actually just saw today that 10 years ago today, they finally took Terry Schiavo off of life support. This is the document that got a lot of press at that time. People still are not doing it, and there are still issues. So this is the document that says what you would want to happen in the event that you are in a terminal condition or permanent unconscious state. These are two conditions in which you are alive, but life support is only going to maintain your life. You are never coming out of this unconscious state. So this is where you say, I would like food, water, hydration. Maybe you have other things you want to be there for 14 days. Maybe you have, you want pain medication. But this is where you lay out those wishes. And then your healthcare agent under your power of attorney is the one who actually makes that decision for you. So these are kind of the basic documents that we would ask people, or we'd advise people to do during their lifetimes. These are the documents that we would have you execute that would apply after death. So the first one is a will or a revocable living trust. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but this is the basic document that transfers your property at death. And I'll talk about the differences between those two things. In Washington, if you have a heart icon on your driver's license, you have agreed to donate your organs and tissues for both research and transplant. You can go to the website donatelifetoday.com and you can make limitations on your gift. But do know that this technically overrides everyone else's decision. They're not going to necessarily need to ask your spouse. They might out of a courtesy, but they don't have to. But this is a pretty broad consent. So you should be aware, when you just check the box and got the little heart icon, that you actually consented to donating pretty much everything. Disposition of remains. This is a document that allows you to set forth ahead of time what you would like to happen at your death, if you want to be buried or cremated, and if you have any specific instructions for your memorial. This is probably my favorite document because people come up with some pretty crazy stuff. We recently had someone who wanted his cremated remains sprinkled on mashed potatoes so that people could eat them. And so we wrote that in because he wasn't really kidding, and then his wife was like, he was kidding, and we were like, I don't know that he was kidding. So this is something that you can think about if you have a place you want to be scattered or you have a place you want to be buried. You can kind of set that forth ahead of time. The coordination of your non-probate assets. So certain assets pass outside of your will and your revocable trust. These would be things that pass with beneficiary designations. So you have life insurance, annuities, IRAs, 401ks. Certain types of bank accounts might pass according to beneficiary designations or co-owners on the account. These are things you want to make sure that line up with the rest of your estate planning. So it's as part of our sort of due diligence when we do these plans for people, we make sure that everything coordinates and matches up so you don't have one asset that suddenly goes to some estranged family member. So a lot of the questions for people is, do I want a will or do I want a revocable living trust? As you can see from the chart, they're pretty much the same document. Both of them are going to set forth what do you want to happen after your death. The main differences, and this is one that people typically come in and they hear about, is that you can avoid probate with a trust. And this is true to an extent. So if you set up a revocable living trust, it's a document, you actually put your property into it while you're alive, and then at death, it has all the provisions. If you're a married couple, you're both part of the trust. And it sets up all these trusts and beneficiaries after your deaths. As long as all of your property is actually in the trust, you will in fact avoid probate. The problem is that most people, or some people, don't put everything in the trust. They have it, they put their house and maybe a couple bank accounts, but then they forget, 25 years goes by, they die, and half of their stuff is in their individual names. At that point, we now have to go to probate, open probate, move everything to the trust, and then move everything to the beneficiaries. And so they haven't successfully avoided probate with that. That's an issue in states like California and Hawaii where probate is extremely expensive. Washington's not as much of an issue. It's pretty straightforward here. The cost difference is nominal. So it's not as big of a deal for that reason. But the second reason most people do a revocable trust is that it's not subject to public record. So in probate being the legal process by which you settle a decedent's estate, you go to court, you file the will is public record. With a trust, we don't have to go to court. We can just administer the estate through the trust. So that never actually gets to public record. So any celebrity you've ever seen, the will on record, all it says is, Michael Jackson's estate goes to the Michael Jackson Trust. You don't know who he gave his estate to. So that's another reason, if you have a reason to believe that people will be interested in your estate, if you feel like you just don't want people to know who you're leaving your collection to or where it's going, a trust is the. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same thing. We'll pay taxes, we'll take an inventory, creditor claims will be made against it. Ultimately, we'll distribute the assets to the beneficiaries. I did not put these special effects in here.
You mentioned the trust.
Yes.
Does that apply for the most part nationwide?
For revocable trusts? Yeah, so another thing to note about revocable trusts, if you have real estate in other states, you have to go through probate in every state that you own real estate. If you have a trust, you put all of those properties into a trust, you can avoid probate everywhere. So some clients, maybe it's just, we're gonna do a little single standalone trust for their Hawaii property. Other people who have a number of homes will actually put everything into a trust and they can avoid probate. So, yes. Not every country recognizes revocable trusts, so that's just something to keep in mind. Should you use a testamentary trust? So a testamentary trust is a trust that you set up under your will or revocable trust for the benefit of some beneficiary. It doesn't exist until you die, and at that point, once we're figuring out what you own, we see what goes into the trust and it's funded at that time. There are a couple of benefits to using a testamentary trust. The first is that you get to establish ahead of time who the beneficiaries are, who's the trustee, and that's the person that would actually administer the assets, invest them, make distributions to the beneficiaries, and you get to decide the terms of the trust. So for those of you who have, collections, if you have some idea of what you would like to happen, it's really nice to be able to set up ahead of time all of those things in a trust. If you just give me some, I should say, if you give something to somebody outright, they can do whatever they want with it. Giving it to them outright and saying, I hope that you are responsible with this, or I hope that you give this to your brother when you die, that's not binding. There's nothing binding about that. They don't have to follow it. So if you want to give somebody something and you want to set some sort of limit on it, you need a trust. Another benefit to a trust is that assets held in a testamentary trust are protected from creditors. They're protected from spousal claims. And also, depending on an estate tax situation, the trust may be exempt from estate taxes upon the passing of each generation. So there's a lot of reasons to use a testamentary trust, and this is sort of a list. I would say for this sort of audience, if you have specific desires regarding the ongoing administration of your collections or your photography, I would absolutely look into using a trust to set forth those types of things. So on to the question of estate taxes. So we have a Washington state estate tax, and we also have a federal estate tax. So in Washington, the exemption is $2.054 million per person. It means collectively as a couple, you can pass about $4 million to your heirs tax-free. At the federal level, we have a $5.43 million exemption. And so again, we have sort of a $10 million can pass free of federal estate tax. The rates on that, you're looking at 10 to 20% depending on how much over that $2 million or $4 million mark you are. 10 to 20% at the state level and about 40% at the federal level. When you're thinking about your estate and deciding if you have an estate tax issue, in addition to taking into account your collection, which as Ellen sort of pointed out before, if you wait until death, all of your assets get a step up in basis to fair market value. So at that point, your collection is now being valued at its fair market value, not at that, how much did the paint and the canvas cost. So it's going to be the value of your collection and then the value of the rest of your estate. Keep in mind the value of life insurance proceeds. If you have $1 million policy, your husband has $1 million policy, you now already have $2 million worth of assets, even if you don't necessarily get to enjoy them because you're dead. All of your separate property, 50% of community property. I won't get into those distinctions here, but just be aware that those are parts of your gross estate for estate tax purposes. Some things to think about for photographers and collectors. The first thing is the inventory, and I think all of us are going to harp on that repeatedly tonight. What do you own and where is it located? So one of the first things that happens after death, that's the responsibility of the personal representative or the trustee of your trust, is what do you own and where is it? And that can be really difficult to figure out, especially if you weren't organized during life. The next thing is document items that are loaned. All of your contracts need to be documented. There's been an interesting case in the last year that some of you might have heard about with the Andy Warhol painting of Farrah Fawcett. So this was, there were 2 paintings that Andy Warhol did of Farrah Fawcett, and she apparently had them both in her house for a very long time, and then her ex-boyfriend, ex-husband, I'm not sure if they were married, Ryan O'Neal, took one and said, well, Andy Warhol gave me one, he gave her one. So he takes it to his house. Well, Farrah Fawcett dies. The whole estate goes through her living trust, but for whatever reason, we happen to know that University of Texas is the beneficiary of this artwork. And they say, no, that was ours. And I think there had been a question of whether she loaned it or what exactly the deal was, but it ended up coming down that it was his, and they ended up settling. But it took 3 years. It was $1 million worth of attorney's fees. And if they had just had paperwork or there was some sort of paper trail that this had actually been given to him, that would have helped tremendously and been much, much cheaper. But like we said at the beginning, sometimes the lawyers are actually your heirs. This would be that case. Other questions, who do you want to inherit your collection? Is it the same person that you want to have control of your estate or the rest of your estate? These are questions we ask all clients, but maybe more pertinent here if you have someone who maybe doesn't appreciate the work that you're doing, you have multiple children, you just want to consider maybe a charitable or non-charitable beneficiary. Jennifer's going to talk more about giving your work to charity in her segment. Who do you want to administer your estate? And does that differ for managing your collection versus the rest of your estate? Do you want to name 2 personal representatives and assign one sort of the job of inventorying everything you own and handling that side of it, and then have somebody else deal with the rest of your sort of typical assets? Who do you want to manage your work going forward? Again, is this the same person? Do you have different people in mind? Is this the same person you want to benefit financially from your work going forward? Thinking through items like, do you want licensing or reproductions? Are those going to be allowed? If so, under what circumstances? Again, what you've said during your lifetime, what your wishes are expressed are not, people may follow them, but ultimately they're not going to be binding unless you put them in writing somewhere. The last 2 kind of tie in together, which is how you're going to provide for the ongoing maintenance costs for your collection and storage for collections, and how are you going to pay debts and estate taxes. So if the bulk of your net worth is tied up in sort of your work, how are we going to find the liquidity to pay these taxes and these debts? The IRS doesn't want your photos, as it turns out. So one of the best ways I think to do that, to answer that question, is to do life insurance. So if you're still insurable and you can get a term policy, they are fairly cheap. You can get them fairly large, and you can use a life insurance policy to provide the liquidity you need. You can pay debts, you can pay estate taxes, you can provide the storage costs. Jennifer will talk about this a little bit more. You can provide an endowment for a charity to take your collection. Sometimes they don't want it on its own, they want money along with it so that they can afford to manage it. And also, we've seen people use life insurance to equalize bequests between beneficiaries. So if you are thinking, my collection's gonna go here, but I don't wanna leave this child out in the dark, maybe life insurance is a good way to sort of equalize your estate between children. Next up on the list is digital assets. So I actually have an hour-long presentation on just digital assets, so this is going to be a very shortened version. But to say that all of these things are digital assets, they exist everywhere. People have a ton of them. You probably don't even know how many how many of these accounts you had and you've thrown away, which ones are valuable, that type of thing. This is becoming a bigger issue within estate planning. So one of the questions is, do you own your digital assets? So every online account and service that you're using is governed by the terms of service agreement. And that overrides anything else you're doing. That is the contract between you and Google, you and Facebook, you and any other service. For the most part, these are agreements that say you have a license to access Gmail, but you have a property right in the actual content that you're creating within Gmail. Or say you have a property right in the content that you are uploading to Facebook. What's interesting is that the license is not transferable. So you cannot technically allow other people to log into your accounts. It is a violation of the terms of service agreement. However, you can get your hands on the property component sometime, for the most part. You can get your hands on the property component, but you need to actually ask the service provider for that information. And you have to have someone who has the authority to do so.
Typically, that would be the person managing the estate.
Yes, so it would be in a probate, you'd have your personal representative that's appointed under the will. That's the person that steps into the shoes of the decedent. Under a trust, you might have a trustee. In an LLC, which we'll talk about at the very end, it would be a manager. And under the powers of attorney, it'd be the agents that you've appointed. So digital assets pose some unique issues when we're dealing with them. First is that people don't think when they're inventorying their estate to actually inventory their digital assets. Like I said, there's a lot, and they come in a couple of varieties, which is some have just sentimental value. It's just your personal accounts, what would you want to happen to them, your family photos that you put on Flickr. Others have monetary value, so that would be your business accounts if you're using some sort of service to store your photos, if you're using some sort of domain to display your photos. There may actually be economic value there. And then all the other, every online banking account, every online sales account that you have. The issues that we run into are typically limits on access. So like I said, most services, you are not actually allowed to log into somebody else's account. Also, they will never, ever, ever give you the username and password of somebody. That's just flat out, they won't do that. So if we don't know the username and password, there's no chance we could get in even if we wanted to or were allowed to. There's also some state and federal laws that come into play. One's a Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and the other one's an Electronic Communications Act that are sort of out there as things that could be used if you quote unquote exceed your authorized access to these accounts. I don't know very many people who have actually been prosecuted under these, but just to know that there are sort of these federal laws looming that say, and they were all developed in the 80s when we were worried about hackers and things that are just out there still and could technically apply in these situations. There's limits on use and copying certain items. Not as much anymore, but a lot of the music used to have DRM encryption so that you couldn't copy it. But you do have to watch sort of the actual copyright issues when it comes to digital assets. And then there's limits on transferability. So like I said, a lot of the accounts can't actually be transferred. So they either need to be closed down, they need to be memorialized, whatever the terms of service say. And then of course we have copyright laws that apply regardless of what those contracts say. So those are sort of things that we run into with digital assets that make it more difficult. Yes.
Can you give me an example? I'm having a hard time imagining how this would relate to, say, a photographer who stores photography in iCloud, in an Adobe Cloud site. How would that work, and what would you need to do to prepare for that? Can you? I'm trying to. Otherwise, this all just becomes kind of amorphous.
Well, I mean, I guess a lot of the question is, does this asset actually exist somewhere other than in a digital format? So did you back up if you backed everything up on a hard drive that I can just plug into a computer and get into, I'm not as concerned about the fact that there's a copy in the iCloud. I can just email Apple or Google and say, shut it down, we're fine, we have everything we need. Same thing goes for bank accounts. People think, oh, everyone needs my bank account. It's like, well, I can actually still walk into a brick and mortar bank. I don't, but I could if I needed to, and get the exact same access that we've always had with my, my power of attorney or my letters of testamentary for personal representatives. But if all of your photos are on the cloud, I'm thinking of say, like a wedding photographer, maybe they have contracts that are outstanding. If I can't even log into that account, that's the first issue. And then I have to look at the terms of service and say, okay, if I have the username and password, am I allowed to log in? And if not, how do I get these assets? Do I send a letter to Google? How do I actually get a copy of what's on there? Because it's there, it has value of some kind, and I need to access it. So, does that help?
Yeah, and then what happens, say someone does die, leaving a great deal of photography in the cloud, say, and without a backup, what happens to it if nobody can access it?
That's a good question. I think most of the companies are now coming around to the idea that they are getting these letters, and users are dying, and people want access. They want copies of the emails that they've sent. They want to get on, various websites and pull down the family photos, or at least get a copy of the family photos. But there are some sites, and I didn't look it up before I came, but Yahoo, their policy, at least it used to be, that they would delete everything, and that includes everything they own, which is Flickr. And lots of people, for a very long time, were using Flickr. And so that's a problem. It's a problem if somebody just notifies Yahoo and says, hey, my friend Jane died, and someone's been using her, email account, and that's connected to Flickr, and they just shut it down and delete everything. That's an issue. So I haven't seen it play out in the worst way yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we hear about it.
Is there a document where you can specify what is to be done? Tell Yahoo, if I die, my wife gets to.
Why, yes, it's called your will.
Oh, well. Good.
Here. So here are recommendations for digital assets. First, we're back to the inventory. We actually have a separate inventory for digital assets. It's something you can keep on the side. What services are you using, and then username, password, and the security questions. There are lots of websites out there that will, say, oh, PS Money, and you can have, the one. I think there's one like LastPass and things that have one, password that gets you into all of your passwords. I'm not going to comment on the security of those. Personally, I keep mine in writing because at this point nobody's breaking into my house and stealing paper anymore. So I'm not really concerned about the security. As long as my husband can find it, my family can find it, I think it's perfectly fine. But it is important to write them down. And like I said, you might not actually be able to access it, or you might not be permitted to under the terms of service, but at least we have it if we can. Including assets in your digital estate plan, so actually saying what you want done. Do you want your Facebook account to live on forever? Do you want your photos to be displayed on your website forever? What are we supposed to do with this once you're gone? Delete it, memorialize it, maintain it, and then specifically authorize your fiduciaries. So there's actually the Uniform Laws Commission recently passed, or they came up with sort of what they call uniform laws regarding access to digital assets. basically saying that these people, the whole point of personal representatives and agents are to step into the shoes of the decedent, and in this case, they should be allowed to do so and should not face repercussions. Washington doesn't have one yet, but I think we're getting there. So, you know, just specifically, I want to be able to go, if I need to court and say, no, look, her will says, I specifically authorize this person, regardless of federal law, you know, I'm authorizing this person to step in and access these assets. And at the, you know, at least that gives us something to stand on rather than saying, well, of course you want me to do that, you know? So that's kind of the recommendation on that. But again, writing it down somewhere is definitely the first step. Writing it down, making it legally binding is the next step.
With regard to that fourth point, what was the uniform law that someone's trying to get adopted?
Yeah, so there's a, what's that?
Just what was it called?
I think it's called the Uniform Laws Commission. They come up with sort of these, you know, because the law is extremely slow to change to anything. And so these people came up with this big law explaining basically how it should work. And then the states usually, sometimes they'll adopt it wholesale. They'll say, we're just going to take this law that somebody else wrote, we're going to adopt it in our state. Other times they'll make changes to it when they adopt it. And so I know it's being talked about in Washington, just hasn't been done yet.
What was it called?
When?
What was it called?
The actual law?
Yeah, I mean, there's uniform laws on all sorts of subjects. What was this?
I think it's digital assets.
Oh, uniform law for digital assets.
Yeah.
Access?
I'm sure if you Google that, you can find it.
Yeah, thanks.
So the last part, I'm going to kind of go through kind of quickly. So for those of you who are actually in, you know, in a profession that you might have employees that might be a little bit dangerous in terms of, you know, you have people on set, maybe we're going to talk a little bit about using limited liability companies and why you should consider one. So take a scenario where you have, there we go. Take a scenario where this is sort of your estate, right? You have a house, you've got an IRA 401ks, you've got personal property, you've got your actual collection, and maybe you have a business bank account, maybe you have some personal bank accounts. So you're at a photo shoot and one of your models falls off of a platform and is injured, or he falls out of a cherry picker and is injured. And he decides to sue you because he was on your set and he was there working for you, and so he sues you. So in this scenario, he can sue you, he can access all of these assets except your IRAs and 401ks. Those are protected from creditors under state statutes. However, if you get elected to entitize yourself as an LLC or some other corporation, you can do this with a C Corp or an S Corp, even a limited partnership. So you've decided instead that you're going to entitize yourself as a business. And in that business, you have all of your work and you have your business bank accounts. And everything else, all your personal assets are outside of the LLC. The same scenario happens, and the only assets he can reach are those business bank accounts in your collection. He can't access anything outside of the LLC. So it's in a sense, exactly, limiting his liability to the assets in the LLC. This, you know, I don't know how much of this applies to you, but for those of you who are, you know, with people doing things like being up in a cherry picker, this is a good idea.
I have a question about that LLC again.
Yeah.
Can I, as a photographer, keep the copyright and license the right to distribute my photos to my LLC? So that in this scenario, where that picture of the photograph is, it's only some of the value instead of all of the value of the photograph?
I'm going to say no on that one. I think, so you asked if you could have your photos elsewhere and then you could license them to your own LLC?
Yeah, the photographs all on the side.
There is a child missing.
Yes, there's a child missing. Is my rating. Right, because, you know, in the photograph, there's the value of the copyright, and there's the value of the licensing, and then there's the physical object itself, if it's fine art photography. And I'm just wondering what legal ways there are to put more of that photograph on the left side of the line so that the model has access to less of its value.
So this is probably a better question for a business attorney, honestly. It's going to deal with how you're using your LLCs and how it's going to come down to how it's set up and whether or not, because the big thing of LLCs is you're protecting yourself and having this business entity, and in some cases things can quote unquote pierce the corporate veil so they can reach past the LLC and get other assets. I would, and this is going back to practically law school for me, is sort of how are they structured, and was this genuinely a business purpose? The way they're structured, is it for a business purpose, or is it to basically try to get assets out of the hands of people, of creditors, maybe? So that would be a better question for a business attorney. If anyone has comments on that, they've done it. Have you done it? You're smiling. Okay. Did somebody else have a question? No? Couple benefits. So we just talked about the asset protection. The other thing about using an LLC is that there is sort of this consolidation of your assets. So you'd be doing this during your lifetime, which in order for us to get sort of artwork or copyrights and IP into the actual LLC, you need to take an inventory, which we always love. So it's a good way to sort of have all of that in one place. It would definitely help at death if you've already said, this is everything that's owned in the LLC and it's now traveling kind of as this unit at your death according to your estate plan. Continuity of management. So in an LLC or corporation, you'd have someone who's actually managing it, and you can name successor managers. So again, this is a good situation with the difference between members who own, they have an interest, an ownership interest in the LLC, like shareholders, versus the people actually managing the property. And so if you think that those two people should be different, using some sort of business entity vehicle or a trust vehicle at death is a good way to do that. And then some digital assets actually allow for business accounts, and they have different terms of service, which allows this sort of ongoing access and ongoing property in these accounts. And also you can own domain names in the names of LLCs. So if you have sort of a brand already, if you want to put all of that into your LLC, you can do that. And then finally, this is just something to think about, which is transfer restrictions. So if you want to make sure that this entity after death is only owned by certain people, or that certain people have rights of first refusal to buy it out, that you can include those in your LLC documents. So, yes?
So what are your recommendations about registering copyright in the individual's name versus the corporation's names? I've heard people argue both sides quite well.
I do not do IP law, so I don't have a comment.
You're a lawyer, aren't you?
No, that is not how lawyers work.
I know how lawyers work.
Yeah, that would be a better question for an IP attorney. Anyone else? No?